Is that the amendment be disagreed to, and I call the member for Kennedy.
You know, I really find it extraordinary in this place. I must have got extremely good education because I was taught at history a whole lot of things that clearly the previous speaker was not taught. But, you know, I urge people in this place to read history books and to know what you're talking about. When she says that people are being discriminated against in this bill, when she talks about discrimination, I mean, discrimination? There's a bloke quotes from a book called the New Testament. He quotes verbatim from it. It is a book that has been sacred for 2,000 years. People have died because they believed you should love your neighbour and do good to even people that hate you. You should do good to them. That's the essence of the Christian message. So he quotes from that book, right? And what he's done is vilified for it. Vilified for it. By people who are super aggressive and are determined to impose their ideas upon the rest of us. And I think we all know who I'm talking about. The head of one of the biggest corporations in Australia, and to this government's shame, they haven't got rid of him, to use his own personal beliefs to persecute an outstanding Australian in the form of Israel Folau. But as a Christian, I have no illusions that we're being persecuted. No illusions about it. And if she's talking about persecution, I know he's been persecuted, and it sure ain't the LBQT, ABC, or whatever the hell they call themselves. It ain't them mob. It's the Christians. And let me be very specific, because I don't make statements without backing them up. The leader of the biggest Christian church in Australia was Peter Hollingworth, and he was hacked to death. The only reason they didn't go on and put him in jail, like they did to Pell, was because they thought destroying him as the Governor-General of Australia and destroying him as the head of the Anglican Church was probably good enough, and they moved on then to the second biggest Christian denomination, Pell. 81 people gave evidence that Pell was over here at point A. One person gave evidence that he was over here at point B doing something bad. Now, 81 to 1. And she's praying for the government of Victoria. If ever we have seen an example of fascism in Australia, we've seen it in Victoria and in Queensland. And I mean, I'm just checking up on where these people come from, because they're not Australians. No Australian would ever do those sort of things. I mean, to persecute a young man, a pretty naive young man, because of his religious beliefs, is quoting from a book that's been around for 2,000 years, that a third of the world's population believes is their pathway to a better life, and tells them they've got to love even their enemies and do good to others. There's something wrong with that principle. But for quoting from that book, whether you agree with the quote or whether you don't, this man was punished in the most terrible manner. His job was taken away from him, his future was taken away from him, and the money that he was looking forward to retirement on was taken away from him. Because he quoted from this book. Now, you know, as a Christian, I'm just a little bit sick and tired of being pushed around by people who have as much knowledge of history as I've got of water supply on Mars. Let me be very specific, right? We have the angelic tribes of the Islamic extremists. Nice people. Nice people. Tamerlane, the statue outside Bukhara, has him on a horse with his sword out, saying the sword of Allah. He killed 1/5 of the world's population. 1/5 of the world's population in the name of God, because it's the same God that they worship, that Christians worship, that Jewish people worship, and that other people worship as well. To quote the great leader in Russia that called off the Cold War, which is now very sadly been switched back on, Gorbachev, his first statement to the world was that the important thing for us all to remember is that when we go on our knees at night to pray, we all pray to the same God. And I thought, this man is one of the greatest men of the last 200 or 300 years. This man is truly one of the great men. We lived under the shadow, every kid in my classroom at school, 12th grade matriculation. We had our transistors on listening to John F. Kennedy, a great warrior, a great soldier, an outstanding soldier. And of course, Khrushchev was another great warrior and a great soldier. And he was never going to back off. Tough little peasant. He was never going to back off. Well, when you listen to Kennedy, he wasn't going to back off either. And we were terrified. Hair stood up in the back of my neck. I looked over a bloke called Eddie Anderson. He's white as a sheet. Looked over at Robert Ribble. His face was red and he just kept shaking his head. We were terrified. Now we're back in that situation again. But, you know, who brought down communism? The worst scourge the world has ever seen. We now know that Mao Zedong was responsible for the murder, death of 48 million people. And there's no question about that. There is no question that Stalin was responsible for the death of 28 million people. So if you can't add up, like that's, how much is that? Anyway, 70-odd million people. What resulted in the death of all these people, these two monsters and the monster of communism. Well, who brought communism down? Well, was it Lech Walesa and his mentor, the Pope of Rome? Was it the Christian right-wingers under Huey Long and a wonderful movie about how they brought the communist empire down, a little group of American Christians who abolished slavery? Oh, well, we Christians abolished slavery. Nobody else. We Christians abolished slavery. We abolished communism. And who led the civil rights movement in America? Martin Luther King. Reverend Martin Luther King. So if you want to look, and no matter which direction you want to look, the New Age dawned with the Medici family. And they say, oh, well, there you go. You know, they tortured Galileo. Galileo was on the Medici payroll. The Medicis were the popes for almost all of that century. He was on the Pope's family's payroll. He lived in their palace. But the enemies of the Renaissance, of freedom, of thought, the enemies, they weren't going to attack the Medicis, but they took on Galileo obliquely. Now, you know, I mean, this idea that the Crusaders went over there and murdered everybody, well, just hold on a moment. The Middle East was the cradle of Christianity. I mean, the whole of the Middle East was Christian. And I'll quote Al-Kabir, who was a famous historian and commentator in 1363. He said, I was very surprised to realise that in Jerusalem, the town was still predominantly Christian, as was all of Palestine. Well, of course it was. That's where Christianity came from. Well, they are being persecuted and murdered out of existence, again and again and again and again. So the Crusaders go there to protect them. And quite frankly, the peace in that 200-year period is probably unprecedented in Middle Eastern history. Now, they weren't nice guys, they were tough guys. And I'm not going to say that they were good Christians, but I'm just going to say that Christians were being murdered and someone stood up to protect them. Those great heroes went over there to protect them, outnumbered 100 to 1 almost continuously throughout that period. Now, you know, the forces of expansionist Islam, because there's a lot of good people in Islam, we all know that. The expansionist forces, Saladin, you know, made out to be a goody-goody because he didn't murder everyone in Jerusalem like the Crusaders did. Well, that's pretty historically true, actually. But why did he not murder them all? Because he ransomed off all the rich ones and turned the rest of them into slaves. I mean, well, it was a pretty bad idea to kill them all. It was pretty dumb of the Crusaders. When you can be smart. Now, they were taking 50,000 Christians, slaves, a year. The harem in Turkey, the Ottomans did not speak Turkish, they spoke Serb-Croat. They were all Christian women in the harem. And if you disbelieve me, the two greatest figures of the Middle Ages, Suleiman the Magnificent and Peter the Great, they were very romantic, very great love affairs. They were very much in love with their wife, their beloved, for the sake of a better word, Suleiman the Magnificent, and Peter the Great with Catherine. Now, both those women were Christian slaves, freed in the case of Peter Great and captured in the case of Suleiman the Magnificent. But there was no doubt that both men were deeply in love with their wives. But both of them were Christian slaves. One of the most, what the Encyclopaedia Britannica says is arguably the most important battle in human history, the Battle for Malta, when Suleiman the Magnificent, 250,000 men tried to take Malta off the Knights of St. John, has stood their ground. The leader was Parasot de Valette, and he'd been a galley slave. I mean, the most important battle, the Encyclopaedia said, maybe in human history, and it was fought by a man who'd been a galley slave. So Peter the Great's wife was a slave, Suleiman the Magnificent's wife was a slave, Parasot de Valette was a slave. I mean, you can get a picture of what was taking place. We Christians were being persecuted on a massive scale. And we're not new to persecution. I mean, our blessed Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ was murdered in the most terrible manner humanly possible. So we're not new to persecution. But when I see the leader of the biggest Christian church hacked to pieces in the public arena, we know by who. We know who was doing it. Then the leader of the second biggest Christian denomination thrown in jail. 81 people said he was there. One person said he wasn't. And she's talking about the government of Victoria. They will go down in history as the least respect for human rights maybe in the country's history. No wonder the Eureka stock raid took place in Victoria. And that spirit is not dead in we Australians, I can tell you. And thirdly, to pick on a very outstanding young Australian, because he quoted from the Gospels, shame, shame, shame. Shame, shame, shame. And she's talking about a Bill of Rights. Well, there's, an instrument called the Magna Carta, and it was written by Stephen Langton, the Archbishop, the chief primate of the Christian Church in England, who showed very, very great courage in risking his life in enforcing that document. And at that point, the evils of monarchy were undermined, never, ever really to recover from that day forth. The evils. And those evils, we saw their last throes in World War I. A lot of inbred monarchs in Europe, carried away with their own egos. Oh, Cousin Willie is a naughty boy, and we've got a bigger navy than they've got. Well, Cousin Willie caused a fair amount of trouble. Like about 30 million people died because of Cousin Willie and his cousin Nicky over in Russia there, because they had big egos, and so we had to have a war. Well, that'd been going on for I don't know how long. But if you go through human history and you start with the Roman Empire, it was Christianised. You move on to a period of the Vikings, they were Christianised. You move on to the period of the Muslim takeover of Europe. I mean, all of Portugal, all of Spain, most of Italy, all of the Balkans, all taken over by them. They, not Genghis Khan, but his descendants were Muslim, and they occupied Moscow. So they were ruling, and look, Crusaders may not have been angels, but I can absolutely assure you the rule of the Ottomans was no picnic, particularly if you're a Christian. That was for certain. But, people stood up with great courage against oppression, and that's part of the Christian belief system, of course. So when I hear people, like the last speaker,
The
you know,
member's time
so incredibly
has
naive,
expired.